Hello and welcome to the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. I'm your host, Joel Harrison. Today we're going to talk about thought leadership. Thought leadership is one of the most powerful tools available to drive trust in B2B, but it's complex and historically very much a top of the funnel discipline. As a consequence, that's made it a bit of a turn-off for many marketers, or at least something that's hard for them to deploy effectively in their marketing. But in this episode, we're going to explore how thought leadership is changing dramatically, opening up new opportunities for B2B marketers and, more importantly, B2B brands. So stay tuned if you want to know how to make thought leadership work for you, or at least work better for you. I'm joined today by one of those foremost experts in thought leadership, Rob Mitchell, who's former CEO of FT Longitude and now co-founder of Exhibit B. And he's one of the industry's leading specialists in thought leadership, and they are striving to be one of the leading agencies in this field. So Rob's got an unrivaled perspective and knowledge about this topic. Rob joined me on a podcast previously to discuss fundamentals of effective thought leadership. And so we're going to build on that conversation, and I'll provide a link back to the other one in the show notes as well. So the basis of this episode is that I've conducted an analysis of thought leadership campaigns, or campaigns that use thought leadership, into the B2B Marketing Awards and the Elevation Awards from 2025. If you're not familiar with these programs, these are the two most comprehensive B2B marketing awards programs in the world ever. The B2B Marketing Awards have been running for 20 years, and it's an unrivaled repository of inside information about trends and what's going on B2B. And the analysis was designed to examine how these campaigns are being structured and executed across Europe and North America. And we've come up with some surprising insights about how thought leadership is changing. So what you're going to learn from this episode? Well, first of all, why the data foundations of thought leadership matter and how best campaigns are getting it right. How thought leadership is being integrated with sales enablement in ways that were rare just a year ago. The dramatic shifts in content formats with video and documentary styles surging, why interactive tools remain an untapped opportunity for most B2B thought leadership campaigns, and how distribution strategies are evolving from broadcast to more direct targeted approaches. So remember, if you find this conversation valuable, please take a moment to subscribe, like, or rate this episode. It helps us other B2B marketers discover this show. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe channel so you don't want to miss future episodes. We'd love you to sign in for these and to don't miss them. They're released weekly. Right, so that's enough of the intro. Rob, welcome. Great to see you again.
Thanks very much, Joel. Great to be here again. Great to be back on the podcast.
Well, thank you. And you're one of my very first guests for this. But your knowledge of thought leadership, why you've been doing thought leadership for a number of years. Tell us how you got into that as a discipline, as an area.
Yeah, I've been doing it for probably 20-ish years, I suppose. I was originally in journalism and moved into thought leadership. And I always found it interesting I think it's like a cross-section between lots of different disciplines, really. You've got the editorial component, which is quite journalistic in nature. You've got the research component, and you've got the marketing component and communications. So it brings together a lot of really interesting disciplines in a way that perhaps, if you work in any of those individual areas, it doesn't do quite to the same extent. And also, I think thought leadership, as you said in your introduction, has evolved quite a lot and continues to evolve and grow in popularity as well. So certainly I've seen that change over my couple of decades, much greater usage of thought leadership in the B2B space.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting time right now. And I think that's what we're going to be talking about here. So great, two journalists talking about thought leadership. That's what everybody wants, isn't it? So we divided this up into kind of five areas around five particular findings that we extracted from the hundreds of campaigns in the B2B Marketing Awards. It's worth saying that, of the hundreds of entries, not all of them are, thought leadership is still a relatively minority discipline, but it's kind of growing in terms of its usage, not just campaigns that are specifically or explicitly primarily a thought leadership campaign, but also thought leadership more generically as part of a broader multi-channel approach. So that's kind of worth saying as a starting point. So the first kind of area we want to look at was the data foundation gap. And this is one of the most striking findings of the analysis. And we looked at the data foundations that underpin thought leadership campaigns and what we found was quite revealing. I know, Rob, you and I spoke at length in our previous episode, and one of the things that you said, correct me if I've got this right, was that data or some kind of data or primary research is is historically fundamental in terms of defining or differentiating thought leadership from kind of other kinds of content marketing. Now, what we found looking at the entries this year, only 22% of thought leadership campaigns are founded on commissioned quantitative research. Further 7% rely on qualitative primary research, and about 7% use first-party or proprietary data. But I think what was most interesting was that 64% of campaigns that describe themselves as thought leadership or use thought leadership in part depend on secondary research or sources, benchmarks, or expert opinion alone. So we kind of create a hierarchy of data foundations ranging from tier 1, which is commissioned qualitative research, down to tier 5, which is expert opinion or point of view only. And I think it does seem like the majority of what people are calling thought leadership sits in those weaker tiers, which is quite concerning. There were some great, exceptions to this, a particular campaign by Staffbase called Elephant in the Room. I'm going to put together a compendium bit of content to accompany this episode to explore those case studies in more detail. But Rob, I wanted to get your perspectives on this. I mean, first of all, does this surprise you? From your perspective in your time, more recently at Exhibit B, but historically at FT Longitude, what does it say about how the term thought leadership is being used or perhaps misused in this industry?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to say is that there's always been a bit of a definitional challenge with thought leadership. And it's a term that gets used a lot. And as you say, it's a term that gets misused a lot. So I think in some cases, the percentage that you talk about there in the lower tier, are they all examples of what everyone would call thought leadership or some people will call thought leadership? Maybe not. My view is that thought leadership does need to be research backed to some extent. There needs to be some research in there. I'm not a believer that it has to be primary research or quantitative research. I think there are other types of research that can be equally valid when it comes to producing thought leadership. And in fact, in some ways, can sometimes be more interesting because it's not the case that just because a piece of content has research in it is therefore a piece of thought leadership or a good piece of thought leadership because although it's an important ingredient and component, I don't think it defines a piece of content as thought leadership just because it's got a piece of research in it. Okay.
I mean, I guess it goes into this place where one of the things that's kind of long-term I found fascinating in B2B is the power of data versus the power of the anecdote. And sometimes the anecdote, and if it's just, an anecdote's told well, can be hugely compelling. I guess in an ideal world, you might have both. Do you think that's there's probably a reason why you can't perhaps have data as a foundation and kind of opinion-led content to complement or supplement that? Is that a realistic strategy?
Yeah, it is. I think it is good to have both because if you just have data, you can end up with quite a sort of left-brain, rational piece of content that isn't necessarily that memorable. So the stories and anecdotes that come from other forms of research, doing interviews with people, producing case studies and anecdotes and stories, add that colour and add that layer of memorability, I think, to a piece of content in a way that you don't really get if you have something that's purely data only or has a heavy emphasis on data, which looks solid, it looks like it's been well researched, but isn't necessarily something that's going to stick in the audience's mind.
I guess the downside with not relying on data is that someone who wants to be critical or skeptical, rather perhaps, of what you're presenting, if you're someone who's trying to take an idea or make a business case investment to skeptical people, if there isn't a hard data foundation, it can be easier to knock that over. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. But I think, again, it comes down to the type of data that you're using, because I think it's also quite possible for companies to use data to put spin on a particular story. You can be quite selective about the data that you're using in a piece of thought leadership to support your narrative. So just because you're using data doesn't automatically mean that something is credible or independent. That said, I do think it is important, and that's why I do see it as one of the the ingredients of good thought leadership is that you've at least made an attempt to look at the wider market and look at what else is going on in the industry you're researching, or the management theme, or the audience that you're trying to get insight into, that you've done your homework and that you've looked into that audience and you've understood what their priorities are, what matters to them. I think that is what helps to elevate something beyond being mere opinion, because I think pure opinion on its own isn't necessarily a piece of thought leadership. It doesn't look like you've made the effort to make it credible or make it authoritative by doing that research to kind of provide that underpinning. But at the same time, as I say, I think we'll talk about this, I'm sure, about trusting content and the extent to which research can be seen as credible and authoritative. These are not academic papers. They're not peer reviewed. So, you can end up with research very much steering a piece of content in a particular direction, a particular narrative that supports a commercial agenda. So, I think we have to be a little bit careful sometimes about about the use of research and thought leadership. As I said, it's not necessarily just a prerequisite of good thought leadership, because you can misuse research as well.
So thanks, Rob. I think what you're saying there, the expression which leaps to mind is a very well-known quote. There's lies, damned lies, and statistics. I think we've all seen journalists and brands using data to support certain arguments in certain capacities. I think the final question that I'd probably ask you on this area is I think we probably all accept that in the terms of this hierarchy, there's a kind of gold standard of thought leadership, which is based on original quantitative research, but that's expensive, right? So are there any alternatives that you could recommend? Are there any ways to build credible data foundation without significant research budgets? And the answer which leaps to my mind is, for example, recently you've got synthetic data. Is that a credible alternative? And are there any other ways of doing this?
Yeah, synthetic data is a really interesting one. I certainly have seen in the conversation I've been having at the moment quite a bit of reluctance on the part of brands to use synthetic data for thought leadership. I think because the view that, if you're commissioning research for thought leadership, what you're trying to do is find out something new. And I'm not necessarily sure that synthetic data is going to give you something new. It may be very, very good at compiling what's already out there and giving you an overview of what people have thought historically, but I'm not sure it's going to deliver any really, really fresh insights. So that's, I think, the reluctance there.
And the reason, sorry, just before you go on, Rob, the reason for that is that basically it's taking a smaller sample and expanding that. So what you're not going to get, or that's one of the reasons I understand it, what you're going to get is perhaps the extremes or diversity of thought, which actually can create some interesting points and make your argument stand up against other people. Am I right there?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's derivative in a way, because it's deriving insights and findings from what's already out there. And I think what it's also doing is probably, if you imagine sort of a bell curve of perspectives, it's sort of going to skew towards the middle, if that's the right way of putting it. So it's a little bit kind of average in terms of what you're going to get. So it will give you a view, and I can see absolutely why it's useful as a complement to other research techniques and market research. And I can absolutely see why synthetic data is useful when you can't afford to do a piece of research, or that piece of research wouldn't have happened at all. It's certainly better than nothing. But I think in terms of good thought leadership, at the moment, it's not something that I'm seeing being widely used. I think because of those reasons, because of a fear that thought leadership by definition should be about discovering something new, and synthetic data, I don't think, does that very easily. So that's, I think, one of the challenges of synthetic data. But in terms of other research tools that are out there or other approaches, definitely. I think secondary data is really interesting. I think you can definitely gather interesting secondary data to create things like indexes, which can be very, very powerful in terms of creating new insight, because they may rank countries on a particular issue, like levels of AI skills or capabilities, something like that. You can kind of use lots of secondary data sources to kind of compile that into an index, which creates some new insights. The other thing that I think is underutilized by brands is their own proprietary data. Very often they're sitting on huge amounts of interesting data that can be really useful from a thought leadership standpoint. To give you an example, a few years ago, I worked with a payments company which had huge amounts of credit card data, and what people were spending on, and trends in sort of spending on entertainment or going to restaurants or shopping, all those different things. And that was incredibly powerful, because what we did was then combine that with a consumer survey to look at sentiment, and you could sort of see these two things working really, really well in tandem. An inexpensive consumer survey with all this proprietary data on spending habits, which no one else had, to produce a really compelling piece of thought leadership. So I think that's another area that I think is good for companies to look at, which can be, provided you can access it, it's not always easy, relatively inexpensive, but genuinely distinctive data set that you can use as a source for thought leadership.
So there's another creativity in there in terms of understanding what assets your organization have and deploying those in creative ways, and perhaps overlaying them with things which might be augmentative without being prohibitive in the cost department. And where exactly. Are you going to spend where are you going to, marketing budgets are finite, we all know that. So, but can you get access to something? Can you expend your hassle time accessing something which is difficult, but then ultimately doesn't have an external cost, versus spending it all on external sources and things like that. So
yeah, and also don't forget them, because surveys, which when we're talking about primary quantitative data, we're usually talking about surveys. I mean, surveys are, yes, they are expensive. They can be really, really valuable. They're a mainstay of thought leadership and have been for many years. But they can also be quite boring. I mean, there's a lot of, quite dull surveys, survey findings driving thought leadership. So they're not necessarily the most interesting way of going about it. And that's why I think, as you say, being creative about the data sources that you have available, proprietary data, use of secondary data, as well as primary, as well as qualitative through interviews, and trying to combine those different elements in more innovative ways is, I think, what creates a really compelling piece of thought leadership.
Okay, fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Okay, we're going to move on to talk about the second finding now, which is around the sales. Well, we've described it as the sales integration surge. And I think what we're seeing here, which is very interesting, is how thought leadership is increasingly being integrated with sales, which is historically was certainly not the case. And there's quite a dramatic shift we're seeing here. Over 53% of thought leadership campaigns include, or programs that include thought leadership at least, now includes explicit sales enablement components or material. We looked at this year on year, and the changes in the UK market, the numbers are striking. Explicit sales enablement mentions in the campaign jumped from 11% to 26%. That's more than doubling. CRM integration rose from 15% to 29%. Sales team or rep focus went from 24% to 36%. And we're seeing more playbooks and battle cards being created from thought leadership content. Worth saying that possibly some of this might simply be what the agencies or the brands that compile the entries are including and representing. But it's, even if that's the case, it's still kind of a greater alignment in terms of understanding of what success needs to look like and where you should be, and the scope and the scale of the program. And this looks to me at least like a fundamental shift in how thought leadership is conceived, from a brand and awareness asset to an active sales tool all the way through the funnel. Again, some great examples of this. Ulysses Love at First Sight was a great example of this one. And it's created over 1.2 billion in pipeline. So it's really impressive. Like I say, I'll try and provide some more information on these case studies in due course. But Rob, what do you think about this? I mean, it looks like a significant shift with thought leadership moving from pure brand building to active sales support. Is this integration a positive evolution, or does it risk undermining the trust that thought leadership is supposed to build?
I think it's something that's been happening for a while. And I think the primary reason for that has been thought leadership has expanded beyond its traditional heartland. I mean, it's very much, when I started doing this 20 years ago, a professional services play. And professional services firms have been doing this for many years. It's part of their DNA. They have faith in it. They believe in this approach, and they know that it helps them in the long run win business. But I think for other companies that are perhaps more recent entrants to the thought leadership space, they're looking for more evidence of commercial value being delivered by these programs, and they don't necessarily have the faith in it that perhaps some other firms might do. And so they want that evidence, which is completely understandable. So I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen this shift towards a slightly more sales aligned approach, because if you do it right and you set it up in the correct way, you can demonstrate that value. You can demonstrate how, as the example you shared just now, how a piece of thought leadership can contribute to pipeline, how it can contribute to sales conversations that perhaps wouldn't have happened in the past. And then you can kind of paint a picture of how that then drives revenue, or contributes to revenue anyway. So I think it's a sort of a natural evolution, and there's very good reasons why that's happening. But in terms of the impact on trust, I think companies have to be really careful, actually, because thought leadership is generally regarded as quite a trustworthy form of marketing, a trustworthy medium, if you like, because it has traditionally been trying to step back from talking about products and services and to be, research driven and providing a slightly more independent view of the world, rather than, your kind of traditional sales materials or advertising even. But where I think this can cause problems is if the intentions of a piece of thought leadership aren't clear. So if you are producing a piece of thought leadership which looks on the surface to be very independent, and it looks like you've done your research and you're not talking about products and services, but actually you're sort of trying to sort of position this as a brand building, top of the funnel piece of thought leadership. But actually what you're really doing is trying to drive sales conversations, and you're doing that in a slightly dishonest way, then I think that's where it can cause real problems, and that's where it can undermine the trust, because it creates this kind of cognitive dissonance, if you like, between the traditional view of thought leadership as somewhat independent of brand building versus sales conversations and sales materials, and these things just is a little bit jarring, or it can be a little bit jarring if you're not careful. So I think it's important to be clear about the intentions of a piece of thought leadership. It's important to be clear about the degree of objectivity and independence that you're using in a piece of thought leadership, I don't think there's anything wrong with using thought leadership as a sales enablement tool. In fact, I think it's a really, really sensible idea. But I do think what we can't do is kind of be a little bit unclear with the audience about what we're trying to achieve with it.
Yeah, I think that's very nuanced perspective. I guess there's no hard and fast rules to what works. I mean, it feels to me like a great piece of thought leadership, to have all the integrity and all the impact that it's going to have, is going to look different to a very tactical piece of sales content. But they shouldn't try and be the same things, because they are. One's going to suck. I imagine the danger is that you're going to suck thought leadership down into content marketing, and then you've completely lost. The whole point is gone. But at the same time, I'm sure there must be ways where the thematic structure and the core messages from the thought leadership can be distilled down to a thought leadership format. But to your point, you've just got to be mindful that you don't, kill the goose that lays the golden egg, to want a better word, by overly commercializing it. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think it is. As I say, I don't think there's anything wrong with, let's be honest about it, right? So companies don't produce thought leadership just for, purely altruistic reasons. They're doing it for a commercial reason. We all know that. The audience knows that. That's fine. We understand that point. But I think, and actually, I think there's always been a view, I've always had the view that there should be a clear line of sight from the themes that you're talking about in a brand building piece of thought leadership through to an ultimate sales conversation you want to have. And I think that's absolutely clear, and it's absolutely fine to think in that way. Otherwise, why would you do it, right? So there's this, you're going to do it, yes, you're building brand, but ultimately you're using it to drive future sales. Not sales today or tomorrow, but it might be 12 months, 18 months down the line, but you're building memories, you're building associations. That's what it's there to do in the long run. So that line of sight is absolutely fine. It's clear that that's what thought leadership should do. But like I said, I think it's just, and I think you can think of it as a portfolio really of different pieces of content that perform different roles within that funnel. So you can have your brand building piece of thought leadership at the top of the funnel. You can have something which is connected to that thematically, but then gets a little bit closer to the sales conversation. Perhaps it's more case study driven, and then all the way down. And I would certainly advise that. Actually, I don't think thought leadership should be disconnected from products and services. It shouldn't be disconnected from the conversations that you want to have in a sales context. But you've just got to be a little bit careful about how it's presented, so that the audience is clear about what you're trying to do and they don't feel misled.
Okay. And that sounds really good advice, Rob. Are there any signs that you can point to that we could identify where perhaps you may have gone too far in kind of commercializing your thought leadership? Essentially, in this instance, the tail starts wagging the dog, right? Anything that you can say, watch out for this?
I think with research, we talked about this before. There's a kind of a test, if you like, of they would say that, wouldn't they, kind of test, where, I think you could cherry pick a piece of research that is very clearly designed to, create a sales message. And if you don't balance that out with other findings, which are, if you're being overly selective about the research, then I think that can be a little bit dangerous, because I think the audience is not stupid and they will look at this and go, they would say this, wouldn't they? And suddenly you're undermining the trust that you're trying to create through a piece of thought leadership, because it looks very selective and it looks like you're cherry picking findings to suit a commercial agenda. So I think that's probably one that I think stands out to me. I think also probably overusing your own people and your own experts in a piece of thought leadership and not talking to third parties or people outside of your organization. You may have a piece of research in there, but if all you've got in there is interviews with your senior executives, and it's very much a sort of a house view on things, then I think that can also undermine things and look a little bit like you're not doing what you should be doing in terms of including other voices and taking a wider view of the market.
Okay, very wise words. Thanks, Rob. That's great. Really, really helpful to understand that nuance and that balance and those things, because I do think it's going in the right direction in terms of, we have to think commercially. We have to be commercial marketers. We can't have content that is a wonderful brand building piece in its own, in isolation. I really believe passionately that needs to be a continuum towards a more funnel orientated activity, and then or mid funnel, and then ultimately a sales conversation. So let's pick up the third theme which identified, which we're going to call the format revolution. We're looking at the content formats being used for thought leadership, and here there's some dramatic shifts. What we're seeing is that video usage has surged. General video usage is up 11 points to reach 60% of campaigns that included some thought leadership components. Documentary and film formats have more than doubled, going from about 7% to 15%. Social content series have grown from virtually nothing to nearly 7%. I guess what's interesting is that audio content has collapsed, down more than over 10 percentage points, which is interesting given the rise of podcasts. I suspect that you might be that there's the move over from video to audio to video, possibly. We haven't examined that specifically. We're seeing that we're also seeing the traditional formats like reports and white papers have gone down slightly by down about 4 percentage points, and they do remain the most common format, but they are they're down at around 60%. A great example from the awards case studies was AutoStore, a campaign called Make Space for Incredible, and this was very much people focused, using documentary style filmmaking to demonstrate the human value for human narratives. So really interesting case studies about what's going on here, and probably part of a broader trend towards a kind of more consumer style content that's going on in B2B more generally. So Rob, just ask some questions to you about this. I mean, we're seeing videos surging, documentary formats have more than doubled, audio is shrinking. What's driving these dramatic shifts, do you think? And do you think this reflects genuine audience demand or just where marketing budgets are flowing?
Well, the audio one's an interesting finding. And when you first mentioned that, I was a little bit surprised. But I suppose in some ways, audio and podcasting has been a bit of a victim of its own success. And I think, what we're seeing with audio is huge demand for audio for sure, but also huge supply, and a vast number of podcasts being produced. So I think what's happening is that audiences are becoming very fragmented across audio, and that may be one of the reasons why companies are finding that it's not having as much impact as it used to, because they're having to compete with such a large number of different pieces of content that audiences could potentially choose instead. So I think that's one aspect of that. As you mentioned as well, though, I think there's also the sense that audio only is perhaps becoming less popular, and we're seeing brands wanting to do audio plus video, partly because they can use that on a greater variety of channels, I think, and they know that people will access that content not only through Spotify, but also through YouTube and other video channels as well. So I think there's probably it's probably a sensible move to combine those two formats to enable greater flexibility in terms of how you distribute it. But rise in video, rise in documentary, absolutely. I think video has become, certainly we saw that in my previous role, my current role as well. That video sits alongside traditional thought leadership a lot more frequently than it used to. And I think for good reason, because it's a really good way of introducing that human storytelling element and bringing your thought leadership to life in a more visual and engaging way, and building greater connections with your audience. So I think it's a really good complementary format actually for traditional thought leadership.
Okay, and you used the word complementary there, and I it's great to see you lending your weight to this kind of transition we're seeing. Do you think that there's a danger to this in terms of shifting to this perhaps more accessible format? It means we perhaps risk missing or losing out on the depth and substance that distinguishes true thought leadership from perhaps more generic kind of mid-funnel content marketing?
I think there's companies have probably always struggled a little bit with this, and I think that's why that we've seen the decline of the long-form report has happened as slowly as it has. We've been talking about the death of the PDF and the long-form report for years, and I think most people would have expected it to have become pretty extinct by now, but it's certainly not the case. As you said yourself, that it's still a very, very common format when it comes to thought leadership, and still companies see a long-form report as the core asset of a lot of their campaigns. Not necessarily because they think that audiences love long-form content or because they think it's the most popular format necessarily, but because they see it as a way of demonstrating the authority of what they're doing. I think there is that if you've done a piece of research and you've spent a lot of time on your messaging, that you want to use long form to give it the space to breathe and to demonstrate that you've actually put a lot of effort into a piece of content. So I think there's a bit of a stickiness there to the format because it's sort of seen as the credible way of expressing your thought leadership point of view. But despite that, I think there is a gradual shift and a realization that you definitely can't do that alone. If as part of a campaign you're doing a long form report and that's all you're doing, you're really missing a trick, because you're going to miss out on a large proportion of your audience who don't want to read long form reports, but do want to consume other formats and other types of content, whether that's video or audio. So that's why I talk about it being a complementary format, and you need to think multi-format in order to, have the best chance of reaching the largest audience you possibly can, because people use different formats of content in different ways. So I think there is that sort of complementary aspect, which is becoming more commonplace. We also asked whether that is actually perhaps a risk to thought leadership. I don't think it is. I think I'm quite agnostic really about the formats that you use to deliver thought leadership. I think what's important is the substance of the content, the substance of the message that you're communicating. I think that can be done just as well through audio or through video as it can through the written word and the long form report. So long as that's there, and so long as the foundations are there in terms of the research and the messaging and the narrative that you use to populate it, that can then be used across a variety of different formats. And I don't think any of those are less effective from a thought leadership perspective than any other.
Okay, very interesting. I like the think multi-format, not multi-channel, or more, perhaps more than multi-channel, because of the nature of it. And it seems like you can't just rely on a long form report, but the question is, can you rely without a long form report as the underpinning of it? Therein lies a challenge associated for everybody who's running thought leadership. And there's an associated skills gap, I suspect, which we're not going to have time to get into here. The people who've been producing thought leadership in the past, probably more orientated towards those longer form reports. They're probably less orientated towards that kind of like documentary style activity. But not time to get that into now. Another whole conversation to go for the future. Thanks, Rob, for great thoughts on that point. Point 4 of our 5, we're going to move on to talk about the dynamic content gap, which kind of dovetails quite nicely with the previous one here. We looked at the use of dynamic or interactive content, and this also dovetails with the point about sales enablement as well. And there's a significant gap between industry buzz and actual practice. Despite all the discussion about interactivity and personalization, only about 9% of thought leadership campaigns include 2 or more dynamic content elements. Calculators and ROI tools appear in fewer than 3% of campaigns. Assessments and diagnostics similarly rare at 2.5%. Microsites and content hubs are the most common dynamic element at around 18%, and personalized content has grown significantly, up 12 percentage points, but it still only reaches 12% of campaigns. Sophisticated interactive tools remain the exception rather than the rule. And one great campaign that did buck this trend was Palo Alto Network's Precision AI campaign. And this really was, again, invested in humanity and their story, setting out their content in a captivating sci-fi world. So this is really transformed this kind of complex topic into something which was very personalized and engaged around particularly visionary leaders. So Rob, in terms of your perspective on this, despite years of industry discussion around interactivity and personalization, fewer than 10% of thought leadership campaigns include multiple dynamic elements. Why do you think there's this gap between this buzz and this hype and actual adoption?
I think there's probably a couple of reasons behind that. I mean, one is what you were hinting at actually just a couple of minutes ago, Joel, around capabilities. I think the teams that are producing thought leadership are generally more editorially slanted and research slanted, and they're less familiar or less experienced when it comes to more interactive and creative formats. So I think that's one aspect of it. I think there's also an aspect that somehow, because we've been talking about gamification and things like that in marketing for years, in B2B marketing, not very common in thought leadership, and perhaps the sense that it somehow is less serious, and somehow by coming up with more creative and interactive treatments for thought leadership, you are somehow moving away from the authoritativeness and the kind of credibility and the kind of weight of thought leadership content, and that also may be one of the reasons why we're seeing this very slow move away from long form report, because there's this view that that's the credible way to talk about weighty, serious issues, not interactive, whizzy tools, because somehow that cheapens it. So I think there's a bit of that as well. I think perhaps a little bit of a sniffiness about kind of interactive tools and things like that, that somehow this is a way of, covering up for a lack of substance, maybe. So I think there's probably a bit of that. But it's a shame, really, because actually the opportunities to use more interactive formats and interactive tools in thought leadership are really considerable. If you think about the data that you're producing in many of these campaigns, the ability to compare different segments of that data, to look at historical trends, to visualize those in an interactive way. There's loads of opportunities to do that, and quite often they're not taken up. Maybe again, it's capabilities. I think really good data visualization capabilities are quite rare. There are a few brands that I see that do it really, really well, but there's a lot that don't, and actually you're still stuck with reports with bar charts and maybe one or two pie charts as a bit of an exciting deviation. So there is that, I think, as well, that perhaps good data visualization is powerful but not easy to do. Coming back to the capabilities point, so I think it's a missed opportunity in many ways, and it's also maybe the kind of slightly siloed nature of different marketing capabilities. Thought leadership, as I mentioned, being quite editorially driven and perhaps not having as much connection with the more creative side of marketing, and perhaps these two things not coming together as well as they perhaps ought to.
I think that's a really good point, and I was musing on that exactly as you were talking. There's all this ongoing conversation about B2B marketing not being creative enough. Be that as it may, I'm always slightly skeptical about that point of view for lots of reasons. But perhaps in a thought leadership is, as compared to advertising, for example, is a more static discipline, right? Or certainly has been historically, and there's been less onus on it to be creative and to challenge convention, certainly in terms of formats. And perhaps what we're seeing here is it's kind of become more crystallized and more editorial and more rooted in what has worked in the past rather than how we could change things up in the future. So I think it's a fascinating conversation. I think the great thing is there's opportunity here if people are prepared to think differently and do things differently. So the last area, and all of these areas dovetail, to be fair, is about distribution. And there's a big shift going on in distribution, as there is in many of these things. There's what we're seeing is what the analysis identified as a shift from broadcast to direct channels, and email and nurture campaigns have grown over 13 percentage points to reach nearly 72% of campaigns. Events have risen 8 percentage points to 80%, making them the most common distribution channels. And it's fascinating that we're talking about email marketing and events. It's two of the most historically rooted B2B communications channels are kind of coming back into vogue. Meanwhile, programmatic advertising has collapsed from 33% to about 21%. That's a huge drop. And paid socials has declined by nearly 4 percentage points, which is despite the kind of the massive success of LinkedIn thought leader ads, which, as you probably agree, they're not thought leader ads, they're influencer marketing ads, but that's a separate podcast. This picture, what we're seeing from this is a distributing shift from broadcast advertising to direct and earned channels, and thought leadership is increasingly being delivered to known audiences rather than used for broad awareness building. A great example is Squire Bank. This is an example from the States. Their campaign is called Elephant in the Courtroom, and it exemplified this approach. And they're trying to really talk to a very, very targeted audience and qualified prospects with specific messages. Rob, we're seeing this. So let's talk about the shift from broadcast to direct distribution. Is this a correlation between more effective channels, or are organizations retreating to what feels safe rather than reaching new audiences?
I think very often with thought leadership, the audience that you're trying to reach is quite small, and you're trying to reach very often a senior audience, the top of the organization. So there aren't all that many people that you're ultimately trying to influence with a piece of thought leadership. So I think there's a view that perhaps more targeted approaches are more efficient in terms of using your resources, and the more programmatic, sort of wider broadcast approaches are less inefficient, and there's quite a lot of wastage with them because you're not reaching the right people necessarily. So I think that's kind of an inherent thing within thought leadership, that actually, the example you mentioned, you're trying to reach law firms or general counsels, or they're a very tightly defined audience in a way that perhaps other forms of marketing aren't, and you're just going for reach. So that reach versus relevance sort of dichotomy, if you like, I think that's one aspect of it. I think there's also an aspect of it that actually, for a piece of thought leadership to be effective, you do need multiple touch points. It's not something that people casually engage with necessarily. And given the depth of what you're trying to communicate, you should have a simple message and a simple overview message. It shouldn't be difficult for an audience to absorb that. But nevertheless, they're quite complex pieces of content. There's quite a lot going on. And so in order for an audience to absorb that message, they do have to see it several times, or they have to see several variations of it to kind of really understand what you're trying to communicate. It's not something that you instantly get, I don't think, very often. So I think that's another reason why a more targeted approach, trying to reach the same people multiple times in some cases with variations on the same message or variations on the same piece of thought leadership content, companies recognize that that's an effective way of doing things because it does take time. It's not something that's an instant, conversion when someone will sort of see your thought leadership and instantly change their behavior, if you like. So I think that's probably going on as well, that, a more targeted approach is valuable. There's also, I think, an emphasis on, you talked about sort of, known audiences and, the ABM angle of things as well, I think, where, you're needing to retain customers as well as acquire them. And so your existing accounts become a really, really important audience for you, particularly in sectors of B2B where you've got very long sales cycles, and there's lots of opportunities for your competitors to come in and access your audience in the same sort of way. So I think you have to kind of stay present and you have to stay visible with those audiences over a long period of time, and that's a very, very important audience for you, as well as the kind of new prospects that you're trying to target as well. But the existing accounts, I think, perhaps didn't used to get quite so much attention from a thought leadership perspective as they do now.
Okay, that's a very interesting point of view. I mean, and I wondered, to kind of perhaps in a similar vein, I wondered if we discussed earlier on in this conversation about how thought leadership is becoming perhaps more integrated into full funnel marketing. If that's the case, then inevitably you're going to start using activities like email or events, because they're much more easily integrated into a funnel type approach. So, and I personally think that's a good thing. I think it should be a kind of through the line campaign. So, even though this might look like an odd step back for some people, I think it's possibly inherent, given the direction of travel of thought leadership as a discipline into a more marketing centric, less ivory tower orientated activity and aligned around greater commercial success and objectives. So I don't know if you agree with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's kind of a positive development, really, because I think there was a little bit of view a few years ago that thought leadership was a little bit separate from marketing somehow, and even though it was usually organisationally part of marketing or communications, but seen as a slightly different discipline and not as well integrated with other marketing activities that should have been. So events is a really good example of that, where I think they're very, very complementary. So the use of thought leadership and events, they work really, really well together. If you can, whether it's your own event or your sponsoring event or whatever it is, you've got a great forum there to talk about your thought leadership, talk about the point of view that you have, start a conversation, continue a conversation, because it's all about conversations, really. This is not a broadcast medium in the sense that it's sort of, you're communicating a message and you're done. You want to have a conversation with the audience and you want to have that dialogue. And so, formats like events are obviously great for that. That's kind of what they're there to do. The networking and the conversations that you have around that are an important part of how you bring thought leadership to life.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree with that. What's better than to get the people, your thought leadership as a core part of an event, whether it's your event or somebody else's event. That allows you to go on to position yourself very well and move on to the next step. Rob, just drawing this conversation to a close, as we've had a fascinating discussion today, and I really appreciate your input as always. I mean, drawing these 5 trends together, the data foundation gap, sales integration, format shifts, dynamic content gap, and distribution changes. What's your overall assessment of where thought leadership is right now, where it's heading, and what are the opportunities for B2B marketers who kind of able to get this right and navigate this change?
Well, I think overall it's been quite positive, actually. I think all the trends that we're talking about, I would see as more of an opportunity than a threat in many ways. So we've talked about greater integration of thought leadership with other forms of marketing. We've talked about the potential to bring thought leadership to life through other formats and other channels and more creative approaches, all of which feel like to me like they are they're great opportunities for thought leadership teams to do that. And there's a lot of space there. So it doesn't feel like it's a concept that's kind of on its last legs. In fact, quite the opposite. I feel like, if anything, that we should be entering a new phase of thought leadership, which is quite exciting because there are these new opportunities and they are untapped in many cases. And I think there is an appetite for it as well. That's the other thing. We hear more and more, from the companies that I speak to, that there is an appetite for it. It's not seen as this kind of, slightly fusty, old-fashioned marketing technique that sort of goes back to the 90s. If anything, I think it's kind of, entering a new and exciting phase. So I think there's a lot to be positive about.
I completely agree. It feels like the opportunity for it to drive real demonstrable commercial value is where thought leadership should be. And the things we talked about here are all providing a means to do that. They're knocking down the barriers and the obstacles to doing it rather than putting them up. So yeah, I totally agree. It's a very positive place. And I think it's more reasons why B2B marketers should be looking at thought leadership more seriously, if not in the way that you understood it before, because things are changing constantly. And you know what? We haven't even mentioned the word AI in this entire podcast as well.
I was just thinking that. Yeah.
So, which is refreshing.
It is. And let's not go there. But yeah, another podcast maybe. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I have actually done a ebook on thought leadership in AI, but which I'll link to in this report as well. But for now, we're just about out of time. Rob, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate being part of this, and I really appreciate your insights.
Thanks very much, Joel. Great to be here. Really enjoyed the conversation.
Right. In the next episode of Trust and Influence in B2B, what does the current wave of economic uncertainty mean for the future of B2B marketing careers? Marketing teams are getting smaller. Budgets are getting tighter. Roles are being rewritten or removed altogether. And many marketers are discovering that the recruitment market now operates by a very different set of rules to the ones that shape their careers. In our next episode, I'm joined by John Watton, one of the UK's most experienced B2B tech marketers, and Tom Howe from Recruiter Jefferson Lock, who's had a front row seat in how hiring is changing across the industry. Together, we use recruitment as a lens to understand how trust in marketing is shifting, what skills organisations are willing to invest in, what's being outsourced, and why there's an identity crisis at the heart of what companies actually want from their marketing teams. We explore the rise in fractional leadership, why AI is accelerating a generational realignment, and what the marketing team of the future is actually going to look like. Plus, both guests share their advice on steps marketers can take now to future-proof their careers. That's next time on the Trust and Influence in B2B podcast. I hope you can join us.